Hello everybody. It is September 3rd, 2025 here in the United States of America, and in today's video I'd like to talk about the parade that China just had to commemorate 80 years since the ending of World War II. Now, as many of you might know, China was one of the countries most heavily involved in the fighting of World War II, specifically against Imperial Japan. China also paid the second highest price in blood of any allied nation taking part in World War II. Some accounts list the dead anywhere between 10 to 20 million, second only behind the Soviet Union in the number of casualties, civilian and military alike, taken fighting the war. So the ending of this war is a celebrated day in China. Victory over Imperial Japan is a celebrated day. Now, maybe not quite to the extent that the Russians celebrated, but it is an important day to the Chinese. So, about this parade. Quite a few world leaders were involved, invited to this. You had Modi of India. You had President Vladimir Putin of Russia. You had Kim Jong-il, the supreme leader of North Korea, as well as quite a few others. I won't name them all here. Those are the big three that I can, I think are the most important heads of state that were there. So for anybody out there who saw this this parade, it was a grand showcase of China's military strength. It was a flex. That's what military parades are. They're generally a flex of military discipline, of military hardware, the ability to march in formation, how fit do the soldiers look, how well geared are they, how new is their equipment, how intimidating do they look, same thing with the weaponry, how new and up to date is the weaponry, what kind of weaponry, ballistic missiles, artillery, what kind of systems and how many does a country possess. Military parades generally showcase all of this. It's a display of national strength and national pride. Now, this has fallen out of favor in the United States. We actually just tried to bring back our own version of a military parade, and while I appreciated the efforts, I think it fell a bit flat. We seem to reject the importance of being able to march in step and march in formation. Maybe we see it as a relic of the past. It's not very important. But the truth is, it actually shows discipline and cohesion. Seeing thousands of soldiers march side by side in lockstep is something pretty awe-inspiring to behold. One very famous example, and this is done every year, is the military parade that takes place in Russia to commemorate their Victory Day in the Great Patriotic War, the Eastern Front in World War II. Every time I watch this, whoever the president of Russia is at the time, the last 20 times has been Vladimir Putin, say, "Ura!" And then the soldiers all yell, "Ura! Ura!" The Russian national anthem starts to play, and then artillery goes off, and you can see soldiers marching in step, tanks moving in formation down the street, artillery pieces, missiles. You get to see units wearing different historical uniforms, and it's very impressive. It really is. It really inspires a sense of national pride, and really makes that nation appear strong. It makes people feel that their nation is strong and robust and healthy. And that's a display for the world. It's to show the world, look at the strength of our military, look at the discipline of our military, look what we have, look at our national pride. And the Russians do it very well. The Chinese also did it very, very well. When we did it, unfortunately, our soldiers weren't really marching in step. They were sort of just walking. We do have very nice military equipment, although much of it is a bit overpriced and overcomplicated. Don't get me wrong, the United States military is still an effective fighting force, and I'm sure if forced into some kind of peer-to-peer war, although, yes, I think it would struggle initially and find out very quickly what its shortcomings are. I think the United States, like any major military, given enough time, would be able to overcome those problems and put itself on an equal footing with whatever adversary it's fighting. But the problem is the display that we put onto the world made our military look undisciplined and sloppy. And indeed, at the moment, I think many people feel that it is, because the United States military has not had to fight a peer-to-peer war in a very, very long time. Low-intensity conflicts or counterinsurgencies don't necessarily sharpen the iron of a military, so to speak, the same way a peer-to-peer conflict would. It doesn't iron out the deficiencies and faults in the military in the same way that being battle-tested would. Which is why at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had two of the most effective fighting forces on the planet by far. And even into the later stages of World War II, Germany had an extremely effective fighting force that was able to put up a much better fight than expected, given the precarious position that it was in the final months of the war. But moving on, the Chinese parade, though, did make the Chinese military look very strong, very capable, very impressive. Also, too, it was a showcase that the United States, that there's an entire world outside of the United States' sphere of influence, outside of Western Europe and North America. There is an entire planet, the entirety of the global South, East Asia, the Middle East, and many of these leaders, specifically from this region of the world, the most powerful countries and prominent countries outside of North America and Western Europe, were invited and showed. This was meant to be a display of unity, I believe, and a statement against the idea of a unipolar world. Vladimir Putin actually held a press conference where he spoke of this, that the unipolar world is something that needs to be a relic of the past, and nations' rights should be respected. Now, when he's talking about this, he's talking about the last 3 decades of U.S. dominance ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. While many people would say the 1990s, generally speaking, was pretty good. The United States wasn't seen too much as a malevolent force in the world, and the United States at that point was still very culturally strong, and many people still wanted to emigrate to America and become Americans, and the American cultural force was still in full swing around the world. Our movies were the most popular, our sports figures were the most popular. Our culture, our way of life, our way of dressing had permeated across the planet. But things really started to change, I think, after September 11, and the world really began to sour on the United States' role as a global hegemon. We began to conduct ourselves unilaterally around the world. Much of our military action was seen as unnecessarily hostile. That it caused needless casualties around the world, especially in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, places that, while maybe not the most well-off, were made much, much worse by our actions. Various machinations of the U.S. State Department and CIA around the world in overthrowing governments and bending political processes to its will became something that really put a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. The constant use of economic blackmail, sanctions against any country that stood up against or stood for its own interests. And I think this has finally culminated, especially after the war in Ukraine and these sanctions against Russia. I think this was the catalyst, though, for countries like India, China, and Russia, and much of the global South, to finally stand up and say, enough is enough. Now, I'm not arguing for or against that. I'm saying this was an inevitability given the United States' own foreign policy and the way that it conducted itself. It overstretched itself, overplayed its hands in many parts of the world, especially in Eastern Europe. That was, I think, one of the biggest catalysts for all of this, was the interference in Ukraine right on Russia's doorstep, where I'm not going to get into the entire thing, but just the audacity again of, as seen from the outside, of the United States getting involved in Eastern Europe, helping to cause one of the worst war probably since World War II, and then its use of sanctions against Russia, its use of sanctions against any country that's trying to do business with Russia. These recent sanctions, attempted sanctions against India, this constant threat of war with China, entrenching itself in Taiwan right off the Chinese border. I think needlessly and pointlessly. It's just unnecessarily inflammatory towards China, given the actual one China policy that we are supposed to be following. And I think much of the world has grown tired of this, and it sees the United States in decline, which culturally and economically, I would say the United States is in decline. Now, President Trump is trying to right that ship. Now whether he's successful in doing so, it's yet to be seen. I'm not entirely sold that he will be successful, given his advisors, and I think that's his biggest problem. I think President Trump's instincts in regards to what needs to be done to fix the United States are good, but the people advising him are not so good. Specifically on foreign policy, he's making decisions now that I think are making everything worse. And I think this parade and the inviting of all these different leaders from the global South, from outside of Western Europe and the United States, was a statement. This bringing in of Kim Jong-un from isolation, open embracing of Vladimir Putin, showing that despite the sanctions, despite this attempt to make Russia a worldwide pariah, Russia is still being embraced by actually most of the world. Funny enough, people don't realize that. I hear pundits in the West often talk about, well, Russia's isolated, Russia's alone, Russia doesn't have any friends. Isolated from who? Western Europe and the United States and Canada. That's basically it. Russia has very good diplomatic relations with almost everybody else. But 3/4 of the world's population lies outside of Western Europe and North America. And I think part of this parade was meant to show Chinese military strength, to assert its sovereignty, and to assert the idea of having a multipolar world where there is no longer a hegemon. There are a handful of major world powers that now have to work together under international law to solve their problems and disputes while respecting the rights of their neighbors, their peers, and maybe focusing more on their own spheres of influence and becoming economic competitors with one another rather than having knives at each other's throats. China is a economic power first and foremost. It doesn't gain its strength through military conquest, although it is in China's best interest to make sure that it displays a strong military for the world. China does its conquering economically. And again, I sort of lost my train of thought over there. I'm kind of paying attention to my cat ripping up the couch. Quit doing that, Leela. Please stop. Anyways, but yes, this was meant to be advertisement for the multipolar world, which I think is heading in that direction, regardless of what the United States does. And I think it would be for the health and benefit of the United States to embrace a multipolar world, to pull back from world empire, let the world run as it has, let the wheels of the world move forward, without assuming that everything will just end up terrible, and pull back to our own sphere of influence, have a detente with Russia, India, and China, bring in the major world powers, figure out a new order of doing things, a new way of doing things that's more constructive and productive. And I think this entire display was meant to firmly plant China and Russia and India as the new leaders of this multipolar world, this push for multipolarity as the United States begins to recede back towards its borders, which is inevitable. I think that President Trump actually desires to put out some kind of framework for a peaceful world, set up its allies in a good place so it doesn't appear to be abandoning them, like Ukraine, for example, which is why I think Trump hasn't completely pulled out of the war, although he knows it's in his best interest to exit this war, to pull the United States back from it. He has to do so in a way that looks like he hasn't abandoned Ukraine. But I think Trump is trying to put out some kind of framework for what would be acceptable world peace and an arrangement for the United States before the United States finally pulls back to its own borders and abandons its empire. But anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about in this video today. I'll be back Saturday with another one, and if anyone has any feedback or input, please leave a comment. And if you like this video, drop me a like and subscribe. Thank you.